Hey everyone, we're back here on the Whirling Circles Internal Martial Arts Podcast. I'm your host, Shawn Garcia, joined as always by Frank Allen of the Wudang Physical Culture Association in New York City. Frank, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you, Shawn?
Doing good. A little a rough couple of days with some stuff with my daughter's school and drama around that, but things are good now. So just the ups and downs of what this year has been dealing us so far. But that's part of life, right? The ups and downs, the changes, the motions.
Oh yeah, it's never steady.
Never steady for sure.
Balancing the ups and downs.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, we're just into the new year. We're about 2 months into the launch of our podcast, and it's been going great so far. Thanks again, like we say every week, to everyone who's been supporting us, sharing our content, subscribing to our YouTube or now our Instagram pages and all that kind of stuff. Following the links that we've been sharing to the different resources, different books that Frank has written, different video and DVD series that the Udang has on their Vimeo account. So thanks for all that support, and definitely keep it going, keep sharing it, keep checking out all those links in our show notes. Drop a review on iTunes if you haven't already. I know that sometimes can be a little bit complicated for folks at first, but it really does help us out a lot, and we really appreciate it. So this week we're going to be shifting gears a little bit, not so much, but we're going to be getting away from some of the history of the internal martial arts specifically, and talking more generally this week about fight sports or combat sports, and what is, where did combat sports come from, what's kind of like the origins of it, the history of it, how has it looked over time, what has it done for different societies, and of course, some modern day combat fight sports, and their influence on the world, and just kind of our feelings on it all. So Frank, just to get the conversation started, where does combat sports come from? Where does it originate?
Well, combat sports in a way are older than people because if you look at little animals, they play two things. Cubs play two things. They play fight and they play chase. In other words, they're sort of instantly training for their stress or danger response of fight or flight. And so it goes way back. Like I said, it's older than us when it comes to fight sports. So I think people have been doing their practice fighting or fighting sports ever since there's been people.
Right, for sure. I think about my cats, as you're saying. There's like, I have little kittens that I got a couple of months ago, and all they do is run around the house, eat, sleep, and then they do like their little combat sports, their little jujitsu, rolling on the floor, scratching each other in the face, kind of stuff. So it's definitely just part of our nature as living beings who are trying to develop the ability to survive in this world. So how does then how did it then mature, and start becoming a little bit more organized over the years?
Well, I'm sure it was a long, slow process, but I think one of the first instances of it being recorded in detail was the Greeks recording Homer talks about the troops wrestling and, in the Trojan War. And of course, Greek Olympics had three fight sports going. They had boxing, they had wrestling, and they had pancration, which was a sort of mixed martial arts type fighting. Uh, my favorite story of pancration is the great champion. I wish I could remember his name, but I probably couldn't pronounce it if I did. Um, who never lost a match but died in the arena fighting.
Mm.
And his last fight was very interesting. Apparently, some guy that's smaller than him attached to his back and was applying some variant of what today we'd call the rear naked choke. And instead of fighting the hands, the champion reached down and grabbed his foot and started to twist it. And at the same moment that the guy pulled him off balance and fell down and crushed his throat so that he died, but at the same moment he snapped the guy's ankle and the guy screamed, "I quit." So even though he was killed, he won the match because the guy screamed, "I quit" when he broke his
Oh
ankle.
my gosh.
So he managed to die fighting, but still
Undefeated.
remain undefeated. And then they have lots of stories. Like at one point, when people would end in a draw, they'd draw straws or stones or whatever to see who got to go first. And one guy would have to stand in whatever position the other guy asked him to, and the guy would then hit him while he was in that position.
Mm.
There's a famous statue of them making the guy stand with his hand behind his head and arching his side forward, and you see the other guy's about to hit him with an open thrust, which is why they point out that it wasn't just boxing and wrestling; it was kind of martial arts stuff mixed in. And they also claimed that the boxers and wrestlers who did strictly boxing or wrestling were usually afraid of the pancration guys and stayed away from them as much as possible. So I think there may be other cultures and other things that wrote about it as earlier, but the first I know about is the Greeks writing about their fight sports.
Right, it's probably happening around the world, but the documentation of it, um,
And
it's pretty clear.
documentation that lasted.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so I guess the question is then, did they start getting, or did organized sports start arising out of the need to train for wars and battle and survival, or were they a different thing? Were they just um, entertainment, an expression of human nature, like a combination of it all?
I think it's absolutely a combination of it all. It's absolutely an expression of nature, which meant not just human nature, because animals do it too, an expression of nature. But at the same time, it was also training for warfare, and especially back in the days when every young man was going to be involved in warfare, very much unlike today, where actually a small percentage of the Western countries' population of young men actually go in the military. It wasn't that long ago when every young man went in the military, and letting them train as children was how they prepared for it. But it's also just an expression of what naturally comes off the reflex of the fight or flight reflex.
Hmm.
I've always said I think people come in basically two variants, and you can look. They you have your fighters and you have your runners. And of course, the Greeks had their great fighters, but they also had their great runners. I mean, the guy who ran marathon, the standard marathon story doesn't do him any credit whatsoever. The standard marathon story is that they wanted marathon, and he ran 21 or 20 whatever it is miles back to Athens to tell them that they had won, and then he died from the run. Whereas historically, this guy ran from Athens to Sparta, which is a few hundred miles. It's something like 200 or 300 miles or 150. I forget it was 300 one way or 300 both ways, but there's a 300 in there. Went to Sparta, asked for help. The Spartans like sort of blew him off with, "Well, we got these, religious games going. When we're done with that, we'll be up there. So hang in." And then he ran back to Marathon where the battle was going. So then he ran to Athens and told them that they won, and he did not die. It's like they really give this guy short shrift as to his running abilities. With he ran the 20 some odd miles and then croaked because he ran a lot more than that and didn't die.
And didn't die.
But
So,
so they had great
yeah.
runners and great fighters. But that's the whole thing, is the basis of sports in general is running and fighting. And that's why the most primitive basic sports are combat sports and racing.
That makes sense. So I guess when we think about sports today, we think about maybe professional athletes who are looking to, take the game that they grew up playing or something and make money doing it, or some form of entertainment. But how would you classify a sport? And when does a combative system become a sport or enter into the sport arena versus just like freestyling, wrestling in the park kind of thing?
Well, a sport, well, freestyling in the park is still a sport. Sports generally, but not always, have some kind of limitations to try and keep the participants from getting seriously injured or killed, as opposed to a close quarters combat system where exactly you're training to seriously injure or kill the person to somehow make them non combat effective. I've mentioned before the difference between classical martial arts, fight sports, and close quarters combat. But sports, of course, weren't always that safe. You, of course, had the Roman gladiators who were fighting all out. Although the way the stories of them come down to us, most of them were slaves. There were people who went and volunteered for the money and the glory, but most of the gladiators were slaves. But according to what we usually hear, is they always fought to the death, and it's absolutely not true.
Mm.
Absolutely, a gladiator was expensive, man. First, you had to acquire him as a slave. Then you not only had to feed, clothe, and house him, but you had to feed him well enough that he was an in shape athlete, which is different than feeding a regular slave. And then you had to have him training all day long, and you had to hire somebody to train them. Gladiators were worth a lot of money. So most gladiatorial matches were the guy was allowed to, when he thought he was getting beat, kneel down, hold his index and middle finger up above his head, and that meant I quit. And almost all the time that was accepted because they were just too expensive. And there were also matches that were like today's pro wrestling. They were just completely set up,
Mm.
choreographed, set up. One guy quit when it was time to quit. And then but at the same time, they're using live weapons. So the same way there are accidents in pro wrestling, and most pro wrestlers get beat up more than real athletes because of the falls and everything they take. You could easily have a slip and get somebody killed because they're using live weapons. And then you had the matches that were to the death. And they were almost always some very rich person came and uh, paid to have a death match. Um,
Right. So they invested the money to cover the cost of the loss of potential fighters. They just paid this bigger amount to get the full spectrum of the kill and everything in there.
yeah, they claim in the Ludus, the gladiator training area, and there's owned by a guy who owned these gladiators and trained them and rented them out and whatnot. The scariest moment was when some rich guy would walk in. They knew was really rich because they knew he was probably going to pay for death matches.
Mm.
Or when they had a really huge festival, like somebody returning from conquering some area and getting a lot of money, he would sponsor games. And then they'd have guys that have to fight to the death also.
Yeah.
So they would scariest moment in the Ludus when the rich guys walked in.
Mm.
But still, these guys were professional athletes. You look at everything they did; they were professional fight sport athletes.
Mm.
And interestingly enough, although again you talk about um, run or fight, the only thing that was more popular than the gladiatorial games in Rome was the chariot races.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Which had a little bit of a combative air to them as well.
Yes. Yes, they did. But not
so
only
so
that, but they
yeah.
had teams:
Mm.
the blues, the greens, the reds, the yellows, and the teams had followers that were like the English soccer hooligans. Like they used to fight outside the arena and inside the arena and whatnot. The um, chariot racing teams definitely had these hooligan groups
Mm.
that were their supporters.
Mm. So a question I have is, what do you think is like the chicken or the egg? What starts developing first? Um is it a sport or is it a martial art? Does the martial art come out of the sport? Do martial artists provide the sport with, athletes, like, because I feel like if we're thinking of some of these earlier expressions of combative sports, was there organized systems of combat, or were they developing it as the sport itself developed?
Well, if you remember my explanation of what these things are, originally there was sport and close quarters combat, and those two things would have developed simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And as I've said, the thing that makes a martial art is the adjacent things. You're studying a close quarters combat system from some time in history. Along the way, you're studying the history of the art and the time. It usually has some adjunct system of meditation added to it. You study that. It usually has a philosophy with it. You study that. Most of them also have or claim to have health aspects of health improvement, and you study that. And you put them all together, and it's a study of classical martial arts. And that's relatively new compared to close quarters combat and fight sports.
Mm, that makes sense. So yeah, with some of these earlier expressions of the combat sports, um, you know, what were the kind of techniques that people were employing from what you can gather? Um, what would it look more like? You said that one was like more wrestling based in the example of the Greek. One was more wrestling based, one was more boxing kind of based, and then there was like the MMA ish mix of them all. Um, where there are certain techniques that we can draw back from all the way back then that we see today.
Well, the Greeks, the boxing was pure striking, and they usually wore a soft leather wrap on their fist, and it was strictly a matter of striking. And the wrestling was simply a matter of wrestling. Pancration was anything goes:
Mm,
punch, kick, elbow, knee, grapple, lock, choke, break was everything. That's why the boxers and wrestlers were a little in awe of pancration fighters because they were sort of the crazy guys.
yeah,
And where they developed together, whereas today there's this whole thing boxing or mixed martial arts because boxing has such a much longer tradition. Back then they came up at the same time and it was just the pancration guys were scary. Like I
right.
said, the greatest champion died in the ring and never lost, or in the arena.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And then, of course, the Romans, when they upped the ante, as well as when they had, all the weapon styles that the gladiators did. You had the guys with the big helmets and the shields and the gladius, and you had the guys with the steel mesh covering their arm and a net and a trident. You had the guys that wore just a loincloth and two really, really sharp, long knives. And originally, they just fought the same. The guy with the armor and the shield would fight another guy with the armor and the shield, etc. But then later they started mixing them up, and that got interesting because people had to be really good at what they're doing. The guys that, of course, used the long knives and no armor had to be really, really quick.
Right.
Um, but then they also had guys that fought with their fists. But what the Romans did, they took the Greek soft wrap and made it hard leather, then hard leather with studs, and then hard leather with studs and points. They were called the cetus. So they were really ripping each other up with these beyond brass knuckles things.
Wow. And then, so as we move a little further in history, then we see things breaking off. Assume a little bit more, becoming a little bit more specialized. What are some other earlier sports before we get into maybe the last century or two that started becoming really well organized that you can draw from?
Well, the fall of the Roman Empire, there apparently was no real organized empty hand sports.
Mm,
People wrestled at the village fairs, people wrestled at the big festivals, but there's nothing particularly organized. And people fought with staves, and mostly it was, the armored guys fighting like the jousting and the tournaments and the melees. You had that jousting that you see in the movies where there's just two guys on horseback, but they would also have the melee where they'd have a whole bunch of guys with swords and maces and hammers just riding around hitting each other. And the idea was, again, you weren't supposed to kill the guy, but still you're wearing armor and you're whacking at each other with this stuff. And the melee was who could be the last guy standing, or the last guy on his horse, actually.
yeah.
Um, but that was pretty much it. It's until the 1700s when there was prize fighting in England. But prize fighting consisted of you had a wooden platform in which guys would get up and they'd fight mostly with either a staff or a wooden sword. Full blast, no arm or anything, staff or wooden sword, and that was prize fighting. And in the 1700s, a guy named James Figg was a prize fighting champion of England, and he devised a way to fight with the fist. It's called fencing with the fist, and he's considered the father of modern boxing.
Mm.
That's why you can see in the old styles, one hand forward and the other hand back, and a lot of lunge punch. It was based
Yeah.
on fighting with a sword. But he was the father of modern boxing,
Mm.
and he had a like his own place in London with his own, platform set up, and he would fight people that came in, and he had students who would fight. And then when he retired, two of his students, uh, I forget the other one was George something or other, and then Jack Broughton in turn became the champions. And Broughton was really, really good. He beat this guy George somehow was been there longer and was handed the title by Fig, and then Broughton beat him. But then Broughton had this whole thing where there's a story of him and the coachman, a classic fight sports story. This young coachman in the Midlands of England is the coachman for his lady. And it's one of these young ladies who's married to an older lord, probably an arranged marriage. And she's got this young, handsome coachman, and they end up getting it together. And the husband hears about it, and he doesn't want to say it's happening because that would be very embarrassing for him. But he knows that this kid boxes some.
Mm.
So he says, "Look, there's only so far you can get here. I could take you to London and hook you up with the real guys, and you'll get really rich and famous." And so, and he gets him away from the wife and takes him to London, but he also hooks him up with the guys he knows are beyond his abilities. And he ends up fighting Broughton. And at one point, he gets knocked into a ring post, breaks some ribs, um, punctures some organs, and he's done. And Broughton feels real bad about this. Him hitting the ring post was an accident. Broughton was a pretty good guy. And the kid lived for a month, a little over a month, and they claim every day Broughton was there hanging out with him, reading to him, apologizing. And then eventually the coachman dies, and Broughton feels horrible. So what he does is first he invents boxing's first rules. The very first rules of boxing were Broughton's rules. And then he also invents the gloves that he calls the mufflers, which would not be used in any professional matches for, God, 150 years or whatever. But he uses them for people to train so they don't get
Mm.
busted up training. And also, once he invents the mufflers, he starts getting these young rich guys and young lords to come and train with him because they can do it without getting beaten up with a bare fist. So, because of the mufflers, he also gets this whole thing of starting people training just to improve themselves and be better, but they don't have to get all beat up in the process because they have the mufflers. That was Jack Broughton.
Wow.
And then after Broughton came Jack Slack, who's great. It was supposed to be Big's grandson, may or may not have been. But Slack brought was the first guy to bring corruption into this whole boxing thing.
Uh oh.
He's a guy. He threw fights. He set up rigged fights. He brought the whole corruption thing in like the fourth generation.
So almost as early as these things started growing, there was some corruption and some underhand deals happening.
Oh yeah,
Another part of
I'm
human
saying,
nature,
yeah,
huh?
yeah, absolutely. It's always come hand in hand with fight sports. It's always somebody
And
taking advantage of something.
yeah, and there's also examples in other parts of the world too, where we have, I'm sure, a bunch of like underground fighting, cockfighting, kind of, gambling happening as these unofficial kind of organized sports or combat sports are growing. Um, and so,
Probably around
as
the same time. Probably
yeah,
around the same time the Chinese had their platform matches going,
right, right. That's
which
what I was thinking.
platform challenge matches was fight sports also, and people betting on them also. And there was a lot of that going on, particularly in the 1800s, but I think it started in the 1700s. But the 1800s in China definitely had their platform fighting, and some of the more famous people, Ho Yin Jia, won a lot of platform fights. Kolma, the Bagua guy, won a lot of challenge matches. Sun Ludang won challenge matches. There was a lot of this platform fighting going on in China at the same time. It was interesting. At a certain point, it seems really that Asian and Western martial arts were probably on a par, slightly different, but on a par. And then when gunpowder came in, the Asians did more of transposing it into sport and a philosophical way of life and kept the quality up, whereas the Western went to strictly sport fighting and it wasn't paid too much attention to for actual warfare once there was gunpowder involved.
Right.
And
Right.
that's when the theoretic superiority of Asian martial arts, which again is still debatable, but the theoretic superiority of Asian martial arts came after the advent of gunpowder. And also because mostly the Western countries had gunpowder and gunpowder implements quicker. And but you also got to keep in mind that in the late 15, early 1600s, the shogunate of Japan was decided by a battle in which the guy with the matchlock muskets beat the people with the intensive, massive, best samurai cavalry. So
Wow.
they weren't that far behind.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So yeah, so I guess let's move forward a little bit then, and as these sports are growing, there's money starting to be behind them. There's champions and belts and all this kind of stuff, and maybe like early expressions of different federations and these different combat sports. Um, when does it start getting? You kind of talked about a shift away from you know it being for defense and warfare to now more of just a focus on the sport? When does it start? When does something like boxing, for instance, become very sport heavy to the degree that no one's really practicing it outside of like developing it for the sport? Or did that not happen?
Well, to some extent. I mean, boxing stayed really big in England in the 17, 1800s. In the late 1700s, you had the first American to make an impression in England, which was Tom Molyneux, who was a slave who won his master so much money winning slave fights, his master set him free. And he was in New York and heard about Bill Richmond, who had been the slave of an English general in the Revolutionary War. And when the English general went home, Richmond went with him and became a prize fighter and had made decent money and won his freedom and whatnot. So, because of the story of Richmond, Molyneux went to England,
Mm.
and Molyneux was a beast. And he fought the British champion Tom Cribb, and he really should have beat him. At one point he had Cribb down. Of course, in those days, rounds went till somebody went down. And most rounds ended because when you got in a clinch, they didn't break the clinch. You grappled once you got in a clinch. So most rounds ended with both guys going down in a grapple. Then they'd get up. You had went back to your corner for 30 seconds, and then you had to come back and put your toe on the line in the middle of where you were fighting, called towing the scratch. And you go at it again until you went down. And you fought until somebody couldn't make it back in 30 seconds. Um, and it was pretty rough, but at the same time, it was actually slower paced. A lot when the Queensberry rules come in, every adult gloves is safer. No, it was made it a lot quicker paced.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
so the bare knuckles were slow paced. Nobody warmed up before the fight. They said in the first 5 or 10 minutes, walking around, rolling their shoulders and arms without touching each other. That's how they warmed up before anybody threw a punch. And and the average round, although there were rounds that would go 10, 15, 20 minutes, And the average round was shorter than today's round. Usually they end up grappling and hitting the ground within a minute and a half to 2 minutes.
Right.
But when somebody went down and couldn't get up, that was it. And Molyneux actually starched Cribb, and he was no way he was going to get up within 30 seconds. And Cribb's managers ran out and said he's got shot in his hand, which would be you had a bunch of the old pistol or musket balls in your hand. He said, "No, I don't." He said, "Hitting them on him." And they spent all this time going through his pants and all this and that. And oh, I guess we were wrong. But meanwhile, Cribb woke up.
Recovering, yeah.
Yeah, and then Cribb was the guy. Cribb had what they called bottom, which is stamina and the ability to take punishment. And then they continue fighting. And of course, Molyneux is from the American South and Cribb was from London. And it starts to get this to rain and have this cold, damp, rainy thing going on while they're fighting outside. And Molyneux starts to get cold and his body isn't used to the cold and he starts to cramp up and Cribb beats him. But he had Cribb completely beat when they jobbed him with this he's got shot in his hand thing.
Well, there's another
And
professional
then
boxer who we'll talk about later, I'm sure, who took a tactic from Cribb, which I'm
and
sure
then
we'll talk about in a
well, it
little bit.
wasn't Cribb's thing. It was his manager trained his people
Right,
thing.
right, right, right.
And then eventually they had a rematch, but the whole thing was that Molyneux got really famous and did get a lot of money from this. And like a lot of poor guys that get money, he spent the whole time partying,
Yeah.
drinking, hanging out with the wenches, eating all the rich food he'd never had. So, but whereas Cribb knew how to train, so by their second fight, Cribb just destroyed him because he was in so much better shape than
Hmm.
Molyneux, who'd gotten completely out of shape. So poor Tom Molyneux, that should have been the first American world champion. And then in 1820, they come up with finally a new set of rules that replaced Broughton's rules, which are called the English prize ring rules. And they had stuff like you couldn't grab the guy's hair and pull his head in, which before that was completely legal.
Mm.
And they also had you couldn't lead your fighter to the scratch mark. Up with Broughton's rules, up until the London prize ring rules, your guy could be totally incapable of making it to the scratch line, like both eyes or blind, whatever. But if he got close enough, he could still fight, and they'd take him and lead him to the scratch line and say, "Okay, go." And the London prize ring rules said you couldn't do that anymore, and it kind of made it a little bit safer. But in 1860, you had what is usually considered the first world championship match when John C. Heenan, the American champion, went across to England and fought Tommy Sayers, the English champion. And I mean, there's books on it, but it really should be a movie. I mean, it's a crazy story of loyal, helpful manager trainers and really vicious, deceitful women and these two fighters, one who's a young up and coming fighter and the other one who's a very tried and true champion, a really big American for the time period, 6 foot, 195 pounds, and an English champion who'd been a middleweight and couldn't get competition at middleweight, so he moved up to heavyweight and became the heavyweight champion. So he was like about 5'8" and 160. And the whole thing is to take the rest of this podcast to go on for the whole story. But I mean, the women were crazy. Um, the American was hooked up with a famous American actress when he was in New York because they spent 2 years in New York with ships going back and forth to set this fight up because it wasn't like you could even mail, much less email. You had to put a letter on a boat and go and make a deal, then put a letter back. It took 2 years to get it together to do this.
Mm.
While they're there, he fell for Ada Isaac Menken, who is known as the great naked lady of the stage because she was doing this show Mazeppa, which at the end should be a real horse on the stage would take her off, and from far away it looked like she was naked. I think she was theoretically actually wearing a skin tight, flesh
Right.
colored silk suit, but she was a great naked lady of the stage, and it's this little cute little Jewish girl from New Orleans who like and had Keenan wrapped around her finger. And Sayers had been with this woman for a long time, Sarah Sayers, and they'd had a couple kids before they got married because the divorce hadn't come through. And then the divorce came through, and they got married. And then when he was away training all the time, she didn't like him being away, and she hooked up with this gambler from his camp and was openly hanging out with this gambler. And when he said he was going to divorce her or do something about it, she said, "Look, if you do, I'm going to tell the kids we weren't married. The kids will know they're bastards." And he couldn't have his kids. So he was still paying her money. She's living with a gambler. She's driving him completely nuts. And they had that going on. They both had very, very loyal trainer managers that known them forever that trying to help them out, calm them down. And in those days, prize fighting wasn't legal in England, but it
Mm,
was totally acceptable. I mean, all the rich people
right.
wanted to see it, which is why it got backing. But it had to have a pretense of shutting it down. And so what they do is the train companies would get in on it, and you would buy a train ticket to you didn't know where, and then as if you were a spectator. Then you'd go and you'd get on the train, and the train would be loaded with all the spectators, all the ring stuff, all the fight people, and the train would take off. And the police would have a train where they start following it. But seeing how the train company was in on it, they start switching tracks and doing stuff to get them away. And then they would go to some field, which was the juncture of two or three counties. So if a sheriff and his guys showed up from one county, they just pick up everything and run a few feet and set it up again there in the other county. And they had to get the sheriff from the other county to come in. And this is what went on with the Sayers and Heenan fight. They're out in the country, and these boys are really ripping it up, totally ripping it up. I mean, um, Sayers got a broken arm in the first half hour, 45 minutes. Fight went on for 2 hours. um, Sayers' quick jab had, by the last half hour of the fight, both of Heenan's eyes were like slits. He could barely see out of his eyes were so swollen. They could barely see anything, just these little slits. These guys were beat to hell. And they're fighting, and there's a contingent of 50 guys from Texas who are the archetypical big raw bone Texans. And the first time that the sheriffs show up, the 50 Texans run to the edge of the crowd and fight off the sheriffs by themselves. And then, so the sheriffs go and they get more men from different counties. And meanwhile, the guys are still fighting, not paying any attention to what's going on in the crowd. And the sheriff's guys show up and a complete riot breaks out. And the guys are still fighting. And Heenan gets Sayers, and the referee's distracted. Heenan gets Sayers on the rope and is holding him down and strangling him on the rope. And one of Sayers' guys, to keep this from happening, pulls out a pocket knife and cuts the rope. And at which point the guys get up and continue fighting, but the ring disappears. In the melee, the riot, the ring gets totally torn up. And they claim about 30 or 40 guys go arms over their shoulders, shoulder to shoulder, just letting whatever hits them in the back hit them in the back. And the boy did another 3 rounds inside this circle of guys
Oh my
before the
gosh.
riot breaks through the circle of guys and pulls the fighters apart, and everybody runs for the train. And most of them make it on the train and escape. And the
So who
next
wins
day,
the fight?
it was called a draw. It was called a draw, and they gave them both championship belts.
Uh,
And yeah, it was considered a draw. And after that, Sayers retired. He continued fighting in England, which was why I go back to the United States. The Civil War had just started.
mm.
And Heenan and Sayers become really good friends. And in fact, for Heenan's few fights he had in England, Sayers worked his corner.
Oh wow.
You know, they were buddies, and Sayers worked his corner. And then Sayers started getting the white powder on his boots, which is how you could tell when a guy was getting diabetes in those days. They'd
Mm.
have it bad enough that there'd actually be sugary stuff in their boots from going out and
Wow.
taking a pee and getting the pee on the boots, and it'd leave sugar, and they'd know the guy had diabetes.
Wow.
And shortly after that, he died. Which, oh, one of the things just before that fight, his evil wife came to him and said, "This American's a giant guy, and he's probably going to kill you. So I want you to write my children that she had with the other guy into your will along with our children." And it's like, "Why would I do that?" She's like, "Well, I'll tell our kids that we weren't married when we had them otherwise." So he's actually written the other guy's kids into his will, and his manager takes care of him monetarily after that. And Heenan's girlfriend comes over and breaks up with him and goes off and becomes the darling of the literary set, hanging out with Swinburne and
Mm.
Yeats and all of those people. And then Sayers dies. Heenan comes back to the United States. Can't get any fights in the East Coast. Doesn't really feeling too well. And he and his buddy, who's about his age, who's his manager trainer, um, get on a train and they head back to California, where he'd started. In fact, he was known as the Benicia boy because he started out in Benicia, California's fight career, even though he was originally from Troy, New York. And they get as far as Wyoming, and he dies in his manager's arms on the train
Oh wow.
from some unknown Maldi. But yeah, the first world championship fight, John C. Heenan versus Tommy Sayers.
Yeah, I'd love to see a depiction of that in the films. But yeah, so I stepping away a little bit from some of the prize fighters and all this kind of stuff. You know, one of the questions that I guess is more popular now, and probably not amongst our listeners because our listeners are mostly martial artists or people who are interested in the martial arts. But what do you say to people who say that combative sports is just is vicious and people are just paying and being entertained by um, people abusing themselves, and it's something that should be banned and all that kind of stuff that's been said throughout history.
Well, it's the most honest expression of competition that there is. It's two people in there doing their best to overcome their people, and more the safety factors are put in there where yes, people do occasionally get killed, but it's very rare. And it's people. It's natural. For one thing, you're not going to stop it. All you can do is drive it underground. It's happened over. Well, look at what we said here. It was outlawed in England when that fight I just talked about took place. You can't stop it. It's human nature, and it is. It's just. It's a primal expression of fortitude, strength, will, and it's just the way people are. It's very, very natural. And unfortunately, there's a lot of really. I mean, let's face it. 60 years ago, more than, well, let's see, 80 years ago, 18, 19-year-olds were storming the beaches of Normandy. Now 18, 19-year-olds are going to the safe room at their college because their feelings got hurt. Um,
Right.
and it could create a problem because there's a lot of parts of the world where that's not going on,
Right.
where people still have to be, you know, tough to deal with what's going on in society. And again, it has to do with if you don't learn to stand up and that some people win and some people lose, that's nothing about prize fighting. You have a winner and a loser. And the whole thing is to get it in your head that the next best thing to fighting and winning is fighting and losing. And it's all better than not fighting. And this whole thing of every kid gets a medal, they don't learn anything about hardship, and they're going to have hardships in their adult life, no matter what you do. So if you don't learn to deal with hardships, deal with losing in sports, deal with the bullies in school and whatnot, then you're going to be completely helpless when problems come up in your adult life. And it really is a method of training for what's going to happen. As I mentioned, you've heard me mention before, if you have the easiest life in the world for your whole life, you're still going to die someday. And you're going to really, really freak out at that if you haven't had any practice at all in dealing with hardships. I tell my students all the time that, contact sparring is just a vague preparation for hardships in life, real hardship, complete financial loss, divorce of a non-mutual kind, a heavy sickness. You're going to have those hardships. And the reality is the hardships in life are just practice and setting you up for being able to deal with the day you die.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all really important to learn to deal with this stuff. And fight sports have forever been a major method of doing that.
Right. And I would probably say, I mean, people are always drawing on different injuries that combative athletes are getting and stuff like that. But I mean, first of all, most sports there's injuries. It's just overuse of different movement patterns and catching impact and things like that. I mean, things like people of course look at football, but even things like basketball are just as dangerous, and you're seeing more injuries, people tearing joints and being crippled as they enter into their 50s and stuff like that. But also, I mean, just like you know, there's probably more people dealing with physical ailments because they're sitting at a computer for 9 to 5 jobs. That's probably more
Oh,
vicious on the human body than any combative sport.
that's what I was just gonna say. There's all this stuff that happens to your health for being too sedentary, also, and the body has problems, and it's much better to get out there and move and do stuff and feel good about doing stuff yourself than to get a whole different set of problems from being too sedentary.
Right.
Um,
But
so
if you are a athlete, a combative sports athlete, there's probably better ways to train, and we've evolved our understanding of how to keep the body healthy, longevity, not breaking the body down. Right. I see more athletes now doing like stretching, mobility, these saunas and steam rooms, these treatments, eating right, trying to get good nutrition into their body. So there's more definitely understanding about all that stuff as people are developing their professional careers now.
yeah, and the safety rules get more and more within the fight sports. So it's always less dangerous than it was previously. At the
Yeah.
same time, it's got this danger element, which is teaching you to deal with adversity, which is very important, learning how to deal with adversity. And it's scary to certain upper and middle class children that are growing up being completely shielded from adversity, and it's not going to work well for them in their adult lives.
Yeah, for sure. And do you think there's moving to a little different topic here? Do you think that there's more popularity with certain types of sports like Western boxing, and now you have the rise of MMA, and the UFC and all this kind of stuff in Bellator? Is that a financially driven thing, or is there some strengths to one combative sport to another that is better for creating a long-term athlete? Or like why did Western boxing become so popular out here, versus like wrestling? Like wrestling has always existed, but wrestling, people weren't watching professional wrestlers outside of like WWF for a long time.
But they were before that. People
Right.
forget the history of professional wrestling, especially in this country. But yeah, boxer has always been the boxing champion was considered the toughest guy on the planet. And there's a thing about striking. There's a certain level of men and manhood that just thought that rolling around on the ground with another man wasn't manly.
Mm,
And then standing up and striking. You see it in street fights all the time where they could be rolling around, but they decide they're going to stand up and strike because that's the way they want to fight. I mean, there was one point where rolling around the ground and wrapping your legs around a guy would have been considered inconceivable,
right.
that you just wouldn't be in that kind of position ever. Whereas now it's completely common, and regular street fighters know how to do that guard position. But yeah, wrestling was right up there actually. When John L. Sullivan was the heavyweight champion of the world, the knockout artist of the planet, they said the one man that he was afraid of was the wrestling champion, um, who was this big red-headed Irishman from New York who had wrestled everybody, had beat everybody, and he actually trained Sullivan for his last bare knuckle fight with Jake Kilrain. And Sullivan came to camp like 25, 30 pounds overweight and completely an alcoholic. And completely. And this guy had a fitness farm in upstate New York. And he was known as the Solid Man. And the first thing he did was he had Sullivan live with the farm workers and do regular farm work for 2 weeks. Just they said to squeeze the alcohol out of him. And 2 weeks of just working with the other workers in the farm, no alcohol, just to squeeze the alcohol out of him. And then he
Wow.
started training him like crazy. And he had told Sullivan's backers that if he didn't get Sullivan in shape to win the fight, that if Sullivan lost the fight, they didn't owe him anything.
Wow.
But if Sullivan won the fight, they were going to owe him a fair amount of money for getting him in shape. And he got Sullivan in tremendous shape. And Sullivan fought 75 rounds with Jake Kilrain and stopped Kilrain at the end of it. And it was his last great
75
fight.
rounds. Wow.
I remember they weren't timed rounds. They were, some guy goes
Whenever
down.
someone goes down,
uh,
yeah.
Yeah, but still, it was 75 rounds with Sullivan and Kilrain. And and then Sullivan wouldn't pay him for the gentleman Jim Corbett fight, and went in out of shape and got outboxed by this young banker from San Francisco. But I mean, there's stories of at one point during that training, one of Sullivan's girlfriends came up and they snuck off to the pub, and they claimed in came the solid man with a baseball bat. She went home and John went back to training seriously.
Nice. So yeah, so it seems like there was, I mean, definitely money is a motivator for someone to take on a sport professionally. So if they know they can make money doing it, that definitely is a motivator. And definitely,
Well,
I feel like, yeah, go ahead.
in the days of William Muldoon, who was the solid man, professional wrestling was making money. They wrestled for real. And the whole thing is, it's a much slower fight than a boxing match.
Right.
So they had to, I mean, at one point, I forget, it may have been Frank Gotch, but at one point there's a thing, there were two wrestlers that were evenly matched, and one of them took the other one down, but he couldn't roll him over. He couldn't get anything solid. And that happened till, the fight was supposed to go on till it had a winner. Well, it went on all night, and nobody could move. And eventually the guys started leaving because they were going to have to go to work in a couple hours. And they claim these guys stayed locked to each other right up until the arena was empty, and they didn't let go of each other until the janitor turned off the lights and went home himself. It's like, so it was, it could be a much slower game than boxing, but it was definitely making money. There were real wrestlers out there. Um, in the early 1900s, there was Farmer Burns, Frank Gotch, Tom Jenkins, the American wrestlers, and they were taking on. There were guys coming from Persia who were wrestling them. There were guys coming from Russia who were wrestling them. Um, there was some real heavy duty matches and some really respected people making decent money in real professional wrestling. But then because real professional wrestling was so slow, they started having, at one point in the early 1900s, boxing and wrestling had real matches and exhibition matches. And after a while, they figured out in boxing, everybody wanted to see the real matches. They weren't interested in the exhibition matches.
Mm,
But the exhibition matches, because they could move along and be not have those big long gaps and nothing happening, the wrestling exhibition matches were selling better than the real wrestling matches.
I
Along
see.
came today's professional wrestling.
Yep. That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll do a whole show too on boxing and a whole show on MMA and kind of and go into some more of the history of different fighters and some of the great battles. Um, but I mean, in today in combative sports, a lot of people within the martial arts community and people who are supporters around MMA especially, and then of course the UFC and these other associations. Their argument is that current mixed martial arts today, is kind of the evolution of combative sports. And what you're saying, it sounds like no, it's always been there in existence, and it's not a new thing. But also, too, a lot of people discount boxing and saying boxing is antiquated and boxing is, they're not real fighters. And if they got in the ring with mixed martial artists, it would be a problem for them. And then of course we see most recently when that kind of matchup happen. What do you say though to the people who kind of shit on boxing a little bit from the martial arts community?
Just people getting caught up in what's new and improved.
Mm.
Everything sells new, and we've gone into this before. How in ancient China they want things old and tested. In the West, for the last couple hundred years, they want everything new and improved, and they think it's exciting and it's different. And admittedly, if a boxer who has no ground training gets taken down, he can have problems. But you're seeing in mixed martial arts that whole thing of the grapplers controlling everything lasted for about 7 or 8 years, and then all of a sudden the strikers learned how to negate the takedown, and all of a sudden striking is actually the more exciting part of mixed martial arts now. Also,
Right,
you have the
it's probably the
announcers
leg kicks that are dominating the UFC now.
You have the announcers trying to sell the grappling because they're grapplers themselves, and they do
Yeah.
a pretty good job of it. But let's face it, the most exciting part of mixed martial arts now is the striking, and you have a
Hmm.
lot of matches where they do almost 100% striking, and it's just a more exciting way to fight. It's also boxing is more dangerous.
Hmm.
You see more deaths in boxing than you do in mixed martial arts because you don't die from getting knocked out quickly. And mixed martial arts, it looks brutal because you get knocked down, the guy jumps and he hits you a few times while you're down, but that's getting hit a few times. If you look at who dies in boxing, it's the guys who get knocked down and they get up, and they get knocked down, they get up, and they go like 8 or 9 rounds taking this beating, but being too strong for their own good. And that, of course, is a problem with their corner, with their trainers and assistant trainers. Somebody in the corner is supposed to pull them out before it gets that serious because the fighters themselves, that's what they're trained to do, is fight to the end. And the corner is supposed to watch out for you and pull you out. But guys die from those long-term beatings, not from a quick knockout. And that's why you almost never see anyone die in MMA, because quick knockouts and submissions won't kill you. It's a sustained beating. And also the small gloves. It's like the same thing that head injuries got much worse in boxing, which we'll go into in our boxing thing, when the gloves came around, because the gloves protect the hand, not the head.
That's right.
They do. The gloves protect the hand, not the head. And, and the smaller gloves, the less likely you are to bash them in the big bony parts of the head that often.
All right, there's a whole
And
movement to try to get the gloves removed in mixed martial arts and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we'll
um,
definitely talk more about that. One last question, Frank, because we're running low on time here. Is so? Do you think it's important? Because I feel like a lot of martial artists that I meet who are training close quarters fighting or training, different systems that might not work directly in a sport. But do you think it's important that martial artists are doing some kind of combative sport, heavy sparring kind of stuff? Do you think is important for their martial arts training?
Depends on what they want out of it. I mean, if they're training for their health, they're training to get in shape, they're training to have a social gathering, which, let's face it, a lot of martial arts classes are as much social as they are anything else. There's nothing wrong with that. It's good to have a little light contact, but even if you don't, even if you're just doing forms and exercises and drills and whatnot, it's a good, healthy thing. It will help you to some extent if you're attacked. If you're doing it for serious self-defense, then you better have some practice in getting hit.
Right.
But if your goal is not really dead serious self-defense, then just do what you want to do and be happy with it.
For sure. Awesome. So yeah, if people are interested in this boxing episode, I'm sure a lot of people are watching this and interested in hearing all of Frank's great stories on boxing and MMA and all that stuff. Let us know. We'll definitely get those shows recorded soon, but we'd love to hear, what about those histories and about those different, combative sports you want to hear about. But yeah, thanks so much, Frank. We're just scratching the surface with this stuff. And I'm sure we can go, we can spend a whole podcast going into some of these prize fights.
Oh
So
yeah.
so we'll definitely tackle some of them in the future. But for those who, again, who are not subscribers yet, feel free to, click the subscription button, click the little bell for notifications so you're hearing about when these podcasts go live and when they come out on YouTube. They're coming on YouTube every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so you can see the live premiere on YouTube. Where usually Frank is not usually watching it live because I'm the one that's looking at the comments and soliciting the questions for Frank. But we'll be on there. So if you want to jump on there Wednesdays at 8 p.m., you can interact with us on there as well. And then, of course, if you haven't, again, like we said, drop a review on iTunes. That really helps us get up in the algorithms so that people can find out more about the podcast and be directed to us whenever they're searching, for martial arts, anything related. Also, too, we're kind of in the middle of January here. We're in the midst of the winter schedule for Frank's school, the Wudang Physical Culture Association, which is doing some live Zoom classes. And so a couple of them that I think are of interest to people who are listening to this episode are probably we're doing what is it? Is it Friday night or when? Well, tell us what the schedule is. What kind of stuff are people expecting with the new schedule?
Well, the whole thing is that we have a special Wednesday and Friday nights Zoom classes to replace what we've been doing was Wednesday and Friday nights with the yard classes, which that's out now for a while.
Yeah.
And so Wednesday night is going to be 6 o'clock, the 8 strategies of Chung style Bagua and how they relate as strategies to Bagua and to any other type of fighting. And then at 7 o'clock, I'm doing Chinese philosophy, which is a bit different. And then Fridays at 6 o'clock, I'm doing fundamentals and principles of internal fighting. It's the principles and fundamentals as to how you make your fighting, whatever type it is, internal.
And I feel like that's going to be a really great class for people who are interested in this subject matter. Because you like you were saying before in our other podcasts about how, that we have systems that we call the internal martial arts, but really any kind of fighting system can be created, be made more internal with these principles that you're going to be teaching on Friday nights.
Any type of movement.
Mm-hmm.
Any type of movement. And then 7 o'clock, Tina's doing Northern Wu style Tai Chi Chuan sword, which is her most popular class. And then at 8 o'clock, I'll do Bagua weapons featuring the elbow knives.
Yeah, nice. So in our show notes, we have Tina's email, one of our other main instructors. So you can reach out to Tina directly to find out more information about how much classes cost and how you can log into the Zoom and all that good stuff. I will say, though, it's super affordable and it's a rare opportunity to train with Frank and Tina. And people should take advantage of it while it's still around. So thanks so much, Frank. We'll see you, of course, next week. We're going to be next week going a little bit in another shift, and we're getting more into Chinese philosophy and religion and its influences on the different Chinese internal martial arts. So we'll be bringing you that next Wednesday. All right, Frank. So we'll talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Take care, Shawn.
Take care.